Listen-only mode.
Good evening, everyone. My name's John Francis. Thanks for attending this evening. The procedure for tonight's webinar follows. I'm going to introduce you to the webinar platform and how to interact within the webinar. I'm going to introduce the MLA More Beef from Pastures program. Then I'll go on to deliver the presentation and I'll explain what that presentation will entail. The webinar will run for about 30 minutes, after which we'll open it up for questions. By way of interaction, I have put you all on mute, and what that does is just provides me with the capacity to deliver and you with the only way of interacting with me is through the questions log. So if you could start there, the questions log should be on a panel within your computer screen, and if you can just respond by telling me you can hear me, that's a really good start. So I've got a few responses there. So a few people have got the ability to type in as well as listen, so that's fantastic. Excellent. So thanks very much for responding to that. If you've got questions along the way, you respond in exactly the same way. I will respond to those questions if I'm quick enough within the presentation. Otherwise, my response to those may occur after 8 p.m. after I've delivered. And I'm happy to sit here for another half hour to flesh out some of the questions that may come up or arise through the night. So I'm here for the duration. Hopefully you will be, and things at home don't get too important for you. I'm pretty new to this webinar process, but we've now done about 3 of these. I understand that they're not the most interactive because it's me talking to you, but we've chosen that format because it's a very short period of time. So what we will do is I'll get on to some MLA-based stuff. Look, MLA have funded tonight's program. It's funded through the More Beef from Pastures program, and I am not only a consultant with Holmes Sackett, but I'm also the New South Wales State Coordinator for More Beef from Pastures. And this webinar is really designed to give you the first touch, if you like, of More Beef from Pastures, or an introduction to More Beef from Pastures. So the slide I have up at the moment is a screenshot of the More Beef from Pastures manual, which is available online at the address at the top of the screen there. I'd encourage you to go on and have a look at that manual, because there's a whole lot of great information about beef production, and there's a whole lot of linkages to tools and other things within that package. The idea of this is really for you to give us feedback so that we can follow up with additional events over the next 6 or so months and generate you a return on investment in your investment in MLA, in your funds that you pay, or in your levies that you pay rather. So we're really about generating a return on investment. The only way that MLA understands whether we're actually doing a good job at spending your money is if you provide us feedback. Now, there's a survey at the back end of this presentation. It's really important to us, and if you can fill out that survey once this closes, it'll only take about a minute of your time. That's absolutely critical for us, because A, it gives us feedback about how to do future events, and it also establishes about whether we're meeting your needs through these types of events as well. This slide just shows that there's about 7 modules within the More Beef from Pastures manual. They're in that top green line. Today we'll be moving through the pasture growth and pasture utilisation modules. These modules are really about improving the productivity and profitability of beef businesses by increasing quantity and quality and utilisation of pasture grown. and also meeting different animal and pasture objectives during different times of the year. Okay, on to the presentation. What I'll do tonight is, by way of introduction to this program or to Pasture Economics, I'll run a scenario. Now, I understand by running a scenario, I limit the number of outcomes, but again, I just want to introduce you to some concepts, and we can dig deeper in subsequent events if you so desire. I'm starting with this slide for a reason, because I think that establishing your motivation for pasture establishment is a useful first step. If your motivation is to have the best looking pastures in the district or to have a beautiful vista, then this webinar is unlikely to really provide you with value. This webinar is all about the economics of pasture establishment and demonstrating the factors that influence a profitable outcome. The reason that I think it's important to focus on profitability, which we measure by return on investment, is there's innumerable places where capital can be invested on farm, which I'm all sure you're very aware of. Return on investment's a mean of comparing the financial outcome from any one of those investments. So after waiting for risk, a decision can be made as to the best place to invest to generate an acceptable return, if you're looking at return on investment as a means of assessing the financial performance of any investment that you make on farm. So step one's establishing your motivation. And hopefully all of you logged on tonight are here because you're focused on profit and profitability. In order to establish the economics of pasture establishment, I've used a tool which considers a number of key components of the decision. Now, I'm showing you the Evergraze Pasture Improvement Calculator. This isn't the tool I've used. I'm showing you this basically because you can use this tool to generate exactly the same sort of outcome that I've generated. And the beauty of using this tool will be it will be very specific to your own businesses. So the key factors that need to be known in order to conduct a financial analysis like this, firstly, are the costs of the different pasture establishment components, the productivity, which is measured as, or production, which is measured as stocking rate of the existing pasture and the potential stocking rate after improvement, the capital cost of livestock to graze the additional pasture, and the gross margin per DSE. So there's a fair bit of information that is required in order to assess the economics or the financial outcome of your investment in pasture. And the tool basically looks at the marginal or the additional level of productivity and the value of that additional productivity and the additional costs, and then it generates a cash flow. Now, once that cash flow has been generated or established, the return on investment can be calculated after adjusting for the influence of time. So that's what I'm going to run you through. Now, the assumptions that I've worked on that I think are important to roll out up front are firstly that I'm working on 0.8 of a kilo of phosphorus per DSE applied in each scenario that I look at, and that equates to, or to put that in context, that at 16 DSEs per hectare, that's approximately 13 kilos of phosphorus or 142 kilos of single superphosphate per hectare applied. And obviously a sliding scale up or down depending on the scenarios that I run. My livestock capital cost is $71 per DSE. Now, at the moment, I don't think you'll get into cattle for $71 per DSE, but the assumption was that was based on $1,000 for a cow with a very young calf at foot. Now, that is old money, if you like, or form prior to 2015, and the reason I'm doing that is I will compare a number of outcomes. Pasture maintenance costs are assumed to increase only by $5 per hectare over the plus the cost of the additional fertiliser in the scenarios that I look at. And the final one is that livestock gross margins, I'm basing these on $25 per DSE. Now again, that's an average of the pre-2015, a 5-year period, but remember that your investment in pastures is a long-term investment, and working on current pricing could be dangerous. But I'll talk to some of those sensitivities as we go ahead. Stocking rate assumptions will be shown in the next slide. So the stocking rate assumptions that I've made, and I'm just looking at a perennial pasture to start with. And when I'm talking a perennial pasture, I'm really talking a phalaris, fescue, cocksfoot, or perennial ryegrass if you're in high enough rainfall area, clover mixes, relative to an existing pasture. Now, what this slide demonstrates is the assumptions that I've made about stocking rates. So stocking rates on the vertical axis, running from 0 to 20 DSEs per hectare, average annual, and along the bottom axis, I've just taken this out to year 10, but all the analyses are conducted over a 30-year period. Now, the first thing I want to note is that my assumption is your existing pasture sits at 8 DSEs per hectare. Now, that is a very important assumption to start with, and I'll show you some sensitivities around that shortly. The next point I want to make is that when sowing a perennial pasture, an improved perennial pasture, you move from a low level of productivity in the initial instances up to a high level of productivity over a number of years. You don't get straight up to flat out production. So what I've assumed is that in year 1, the sowing year, you will run 4 DSEs per hectare. In year 2, you will run 12 DSEs per hectare, and then you get up to full production, which is double the 8 DSEs at 16 DSEs per hectare, and that follows through for the whole 30-year period. Okay, so what are the costs? Look, in this analysis, I've made some big assumptions here, and each of those numbers next to the name of the category, which is on the right-hand side of the screen, refers to the dollars per hectare invested for each of those components of the investment. And then on the pie chart, each of those corresponding colours refers to the proportion as a proportion of the total pasture establishment costs. Now, you can see lime and gypsum is a significant cost. Now, it's possible that you need no lime and gypsum because you're not in acidic soils, and acidic soils don't present a productivity issue. Where that occurs and all the other assumptions remain constant, then the economic outcome will be more favourable for you relative to what I show here. So it's important that I put that in context. The next point that I want to make, which for those of you who watch social media, we put out a flyer today saying the pasture expense of $420 per hectare is the small expense of the total investment. And the title of this slide is Pasture Improvement is a Capital Intensive Investment. So this slide just shows that the establishment costs of $420 per hectare, they actually represent less than 40% of the gross cost of pasture after accounting for both the foregone production and the cost of additional livestock. And they're really important components. If you think the expensive part is the sowing of the pasture, you're in for a shock, because the expensive part is the purchasing of the additional livestock that gives you the additional productivity that warrants your investment in the first place. So the major cost there is livestock, which in this case is cost at $71 per DSE. Under current livestock prices, that's likely to be closer to $110 or even more dollars per DSE. So that just means that left-hand blue line, which is the livestock purchase cost, will actually be higher whilst all others remain the same, and thus representing a greater proportion of total costs. Okay, so what's the outcome? So under this scenario, I've run a perennial pasture. We get up to 16 DSEs per hectare. We had an existing pasture. This is a marginal analysis. So I'm comparing what happens relative to the component if I maintained my 8 DSE per hectare pasture. And this is what the cumulative cash flow looks like. Now, I don't want to dig into too much detail about this, but the title of the slide really indicates an important component of this cumulative cash flow. Now, cumulative cash flow is represented on the left-hand axis as dollars per hectare, and it runs from minus $1,000 up to $4,000. And what this shows is that you don't break even overnight. That's the title of the slide. The analysis shows that, in fact, it isn't until year 9 of this analysis that a break-even position's reached. The cash flow shows that for a gross investment of close to $1,000 in the first few years, the cumulative proceeds equate to $3,500. So I'm investing $1,000 to make $3,500, but that's over a 30-year time frame. Now, when you look at that at return on investment terms, that equates to a return on investment of 15%. Now, some of you may be cringing at that return, and some of you may be thinking, well, that's quite exciting, that's better than what I get elsewhere. If it is, you probably don't know your business well enough, because I reckon there's plenty of 30%ers in plenty of businesses from my experience. So where does the cash go? I think it's important just to put that preceding slide in a bit of context. Someone's asked the question, will the pasture longevity be 30 years? Look, it's a great question, and I'm going to come back to that one. That was Joe Lane. Thanks for the question. I'm going to come back to it because I show some sensitivities here, Joe, that show I hope it is, because pasture longevity is extremely important. In fact, nearly more important than production, the relative gain in production. But I'll come back to that question. So what happens here, what this graph is showing, it's aiming to demonstrate the major components of income and expenses over that first 4 years where you saw the squiggly line in the preceding graph. And what it's doing is looking at those components that make up the marginal return when compared with the existing 8 DSE per hectare pasture. So the first pale tan colour shows the upfront investment of $420 per hectare for the establishment costs. Now that's assumed to occur in year 0, or the year preceding the pasture investment year, or pasture sowing year. In year 1, livestock gross margin actually declines. The reason for that is that stocking rate falls from the pre-existing 8 DSEs per hectare down to 4 DSEs per hectare because it's a new pasture without much grazing. 4 DSE per hectare are sold from the existing system, and that's shown as income at the established capital cost per DSE, which was $71 per DSE. In the following year, what happens is, as livestock numbers move to 12 DSEs per hectare from 4 DSEs, so we're going from 4 to 12, additional capital is required to fund the purchase of those livestock. And that's why the orange bars, which are represented by livestock sales and purchases, go so negative. The blue bars in year 2 show the gross margin difference of $100 per hectare, which is the difference between the year 2 stocking rate of 12 DSEs per hectare and the former stocking rate of 8 DSEs per hectare. The same process occurs in year 3 until a steady state occurs in year 4. So that's a really important part to show that it's that the cash flow is lumpy in nature. Now, Joe, I've got a question, a point here that someone's made. Livestock purchase costs shouldn't be included in the first year's budget. Surely it takes 3 years for the purchase to handle extra stock. Well, that's right, but it's not just that. Remember that we're comparing this to an existing state of 8 DSEs per hectare. So it's the marginal livestock purchase relative to our 8 DSEs per hectare that we're looking at. So thanks for the point. this is getting back to your point, Joe. Will the pasture longevity be 30 years? This is a sensitivity analysis just showing the return on investment relative to pasture persistence in years. Now, it's not exactly right because I've assumed that you get full productivity right up until the point where you take the pasture out of production. But really, it's only going to be worse if I looked at a sliding scale of productivity loss. So what this shows is if my pasture only lasts for 5 years, then my return on that investment is actually close to negative 30%. We showed that we were breaking even in year 9, and then in year 10, if my pasture only lasts 10 years, then really, well, I might break even on my cost of capital at the moment because interest rates are low, so that's 5%. If I get out to 15 years, I've done 12%. 20 years, I've done about 14, and it's not till I get out to 30 that I do 15% return. Now, again, 15% return may not be good enough for you to warrant that investment in the first place. But, you know, I believe that this is suggesting that persistence should be a trait that's valued perhaps more highly than it appears to be in the market. Much of the marketing literature I see focuses heavily on the production with very little focus on persistence, and yet what this is showing is how important persistence is. Now, that doesn't mean production's not important. I think it's the combination of the two that's particularly important, and I'll talk to that shortly. This slide shows the next sensitivity feature, which is the difference in productivity. That difference in the initial stocking rate relative to the stocking rate I can get it to is a big driver of the outcome. So the marginal increase in stocking rate in our case was 8 DSEs per hectare, which is the middle bar. Now that shows that we generate a return on investment of 15%. If your marginal increase in stocking rate is only 4 DSEs per hectare, and all the other factors in this analysis remain constant, then you're going to be returning a return of less than 10%, which is realistically an unviable. Well, it's not unviable, it's just a very low return, and I would suggest that there's a range of other places you can get far better returns on farm. And you can see the biggest return comes from the point where there is the greatest marginal increase in stocking rate. So the key message from my perspective there is take the low-hanging fruit first, take where there's opportunities to move from very low levels of productivity to high levels of productivity for whatever reason, then that should be the first port of call rather than the last port of call. And yet often what we find is that is the last port of call. The next point I just want to make is that this chart's just showing the capital cost of livestock and the gross margin per DSE influence the returns generated from pasture improvements. So what I've tried to do here is just look at the influence of the current pricing and gross margin per DSE on your investment in pasture. So, and I also wanted to look at a concern where you may have low gross margins per DSE and to establish whether it actually has an influence on whether you improve your pastures or not. So the midpoint there is $25 per DSE. That's the average from our farm benchmarking database. And the $1,000 per cow-calf is basically $71 per DSE. So it's a pre-2014 sort of level. So you can see that's our starting point. Everything I want to look at beyond that point is really the sensitivity. And the first point I want to make is no matter whether cow-calf prices are low or high, well, it does matter if they're high. It matters more if they're high. But if they're low, gross margins of $20 per DSE are inadequate if you're looking for returns above 15%. The next point I want to make is where we move into the new price paradigm, assuming what the analysts are projecting is correct, then the gross margins, as I showed last week, will move from $25 per DSE to $40 per DSE, and that's great, but our capital costs of livestock also increase, which is the blue bar. So I'm looking at the $40 gross margin per DSE and the blue bar, which is $1,500 per cow-calf unit, and I looked at that today on Auctions Plus, and it seems to be where some of the money is. I know there's higher money than that. If it's higher than that, if it's $2,000 per cow-calf, then that line just comes back further. But what it's saying is that you can generate higher levels of return on investment, but remember that this is a long-term investment over a long time frame. And if that's the case, the key point I want to make is, do you do your sums on current pricing or where you think it's going to revert back to? And my view would be I'd be doing them on where I think it's going to revert back to. Okay, the next slide. So what I've presented so far is just some sensitivities and just to demonstrate the things that are important. The next slide I've put up here is, do high performance pastures generate economic outcomes? And obviously there's a whole lot of background assumptions that I've put into this slide, but this just shows, and by high performance pasture I'm really talking about predominantly a ryegrass or ryegrass and clover mix that has a lifespan of around 4 years. And realistically what this zigzag pattern is showing, it's showing exactly what occurs when you have those short-term pastures, and that is you have to resow them. Assuming this occurs on a recurring basis, you have to resow them year after year. Now, the assumption I've made is I've tried to make these two comparisons as relative as possible, but the short answer to the question, which is, do high performance pastures generate economic outcomes, is it depends. It depends on the level of additional production that they generate over and above the perennial pasture. This graph shows lower returns than the perennial pasture because the investment up front is greater and the cumulative returns are lower by year 30. So if you think back to that preceding graph, the blue line for perennial pasture, we went down not beyond $1,000 in our initial stages, but we went up beyond $3,500. This goes down further than 1,000 and doesn't get up beyond 3,500. So this actually generates a return of around 11%. Now, the short answer is, if in my analyses, if you want high performance pastures to stack up, they're going to have a marginal production gain of about $10 per DSE per hectare above marginal benefit over and above your conventional perennial pasture, and then you'll generate similar returns. So this just shows that the stocking rate, I haven't assumed that 10%, that 10 DSE difference. This is just that preceding graph that I've shown, which is the blue line is the existing pasture of 8 DSEs per hectare. The perennial pasture gets up to 16, and the high performance ryegrass pasture goes out for a period of 4 years before you need to re-sow it again. And so that continues. So I've got it on a sliding scale of production running from 24 DSEs back to 18 DSEs before it's re-sown. Now, you could argue, well, why don't I take it out for an additional year? That might be a sensible thing to do. It depends on what the additional year generates you. Now, someone's just noticed I've broken up. Sorry, I'm breaking up, so I'll just repeat what I've said there. This slide is showing the marginal difference between the existing pasture and the perennial pasture, and the existing pasture and the high performance ryegrass. So the assumption was that the high performance ryegrass lasted for 4 years, and after that 4-year period, you would go in and re-sow it, which is why the stocking rate fluctuates down to 18 DSEs per hectare and back up to 24. The other point I made was that you could establish or keep that pasture for longer whilst the productivity declined further, and the economics of that needs to be assessed, because that may be a better option depending on what the level of productivity decline beyond 18 DSEs per hectare is. Now, I think I've been particularly generous in establishing the marginal benefit of high performance ryegrass over perennial pasture, but some of you may have experience that suggests that I'm not being extremely generous with that level of productivity gain. But that level of productivity gain is what drove this return in this slide here. The final point that I want to make tonight before I open it up to questions is that with any investment that you make on farm, my view is you don't stop at the one you're looking at that's likely that you hope will generate you the best returns. You look at the range of other options that are available to you. Now, in this case, what I've done is, again, I've made a whole lot of assumptions, and the point is not to dig into the detail of the assumptions that I've made here, but it's to challenge you to think about what other options might be out there, because my experience is that we jump straight to pasture establishment and pasture improvement when we haven't taken the low-hanging fruit first. So all this slide aims to establish is, yes, you can generate good returns or 15% returns out of perennial pasture under the assumptions that I've got here, but you may be generating far better returns out of alternatives. And in this case, I've assumed that, you know, phosphorus levels might be low. You apply capital phosphorus first to increase stocking rate to perhaps 12 DSE in this case. Now that generates you a 22% return on investment. Or the alternative is just the old improve utilisation by 10%. And I understand that, you know, not everyone will be up for that as an option because you may already be at the limits. But if you do have that available to you, that's a 35% return on investment. So the real key point there is consider all of the alternatives before you go down the pasture establishment path, because it is a significant investment. And the number of times I've seen city-based investors coming to us saying, we're bleeding here, we're bleeding, and the reason is they've gone in hard on pasture establishment as step one is significant. So I would encourage you not to go down that path and to look at your returns. Now that doesn't mean you shouldn't invest in pasture establishment. It means understand the economics of the investment in pasture establishment. So the key messages I really want to deliver today is you need to understand your objectives. Pretty paddocks are aesthetically pleasing, but they're costly. The next is you really have to know your business to assess the economics of pasture establishment. The next one is the additional level of production, which is stocking rate, increased stocking rate, and the term of the pastures are key drivers of success. And finally, consider the alternatives and establish whether the capital may be better invested elsewhere in those alternatives. So I'm going to open it up to questions now. Bruce Allworth has just made a point here. Take-home message, need to increase stocking rate when improving pasture. Thank you. He's lost me at the end. I think perhaps my talk of alternative investments may have lost him. The next point here is the capital cost of extra livestock is included in the early years of a 30-year cycle. Going into the next 30-year cycle, you already have the livestock capital, so this component would not need to be considered again in the next cycle. Well, that's quite right, Joe, over that 30-year cycle. But I guess what I was doing was looking at, or the intention of making those two comparisons was that I would compare a short-term pasture with a longer-term pasture. But the point you're making is right if you maintain that 16 DSE level of productivity for the 30 years. My experience is that if you've got a pasture that's lasting 30 years, it's probably going to go on for longer than that as well. So the economics beyond that point, yes, is a different story, I agree. So any other questions or points that people would like to make? I'm concerned that I've lost Bruce Allworth with my logic because he's got a fair understanding of this sort of stuff. So, Bruce, I hope I haven't lost you too badly. Is there any other questions?
Excuse me, John, it's David here.
Yep. Go ahead, David.
Dave, John, that second last slide, you were breaking in and out quite a lot. So there might have been a few people missed the point there.
Okay, so which slide is this the slide I'm talking to? David? Is that the slide I'm talking about? Consider the alternatives first. Is that the one?
Yeah, that was a slide there. Yep.
Okay. All right.
Yes, that's it.
The one before that, Elizabeth Butler's got here. So look, I'll go through both of them again. Sorry, for those of you who did hear, I apologise. Look, the key point from this slide is that it's the magnitude of the stocking rate difference that drives the financial outcome. The high performance ryegrass, if this is the magnitude of difference from the high performance ryegrass relative to the existing pasture, it's not good enough to generate a return of 15%. You have to do a marginal difference somewhere up above that 25 DSE per hectare line. That's the key point I wanted to establish there. From this slide, the key points that I wanted to establish, firstly, are that pasture establishment is a very investment intensive investment or capital intensive investment. Here we're investing close to $1,000 per hectare to generate $3,500 over the 30-year time horizon. The points I'm making about the alternatives are they're not so capital intensive, which is, I think the alternative from memory was 200 kilos of single superphosphate as a capital phosphorus application, and obviously the underlying assumption was that there was additional productivity to be had there. And the second one is improved utilisation, which is only a marginal difference of 10%. So I moved my stocking rate from 8 DSEs per hectare to 8.8 DSEs per hectare. That, whilst in absolute terms generates you less cash per hectare, in return on investment terms, it's a 35% return relative to a 15% return. Now, some are going to argue that there's a different weighting of risk for each of those investments. I accept that. And you have to look at those risks and you have to do this for your own business. Okay, I've got a few questions here. Given current cattle prices, even the less intensive methods of improving productivity will still be pricey, since you'll need to purchase the extra stock to utilise any increase in dry matter. That's from Ross Foreman. Yes, you're right. But don't forget, Ross, and this is really important, the analysis that we've conducted suggests that there's still good returns to be made. So even though you're paying more for the livestock, you are getting paid a lot more at the other end as well. So the returns on investment in some cases are even better than the pre-2015 trading terms. The next question is from Dan Baker, which is how much more production does a high performance pasture need to do to end up outperforming a long-term perennial pasture? You cut out, right. Thank you for that. Thanks for, under the assumptions that I've got in this analysis, the number of additional DSEs was 10 DSEs per hectare. Or I think it was a bit over 9, sorry. So where I was running 16 DSEs per hectare in a steady state from the perennial pasture, the average of the 4-year period had to be 10 DSEs per hectare more than that. So you had to run 25 or 26 DSEs per hectare relative to 16 DSEs per hectare in the perennial pasture. What was your return on investment for the short-term ryegrass versus the long-term pasture? Thanks, Ted. The answer is based on the assumptions, I'll just put up the slide that I'm referring to here. Based on these productivity assumptions here, the high-performance pasture generated 11% return on investment over the 30-year time horizon, while the perennial pasture generated a 15% return on investment. The next question is from James Christie. How much does taking tax into consideration affect the return? Thanks, James. I can't answer your question because I haven't looked at the tax implications, and I'm ill qualified to do so. So these are all before tax, and will it have an impact? I honestly don't know. You may probably know better than I do, but I don't know is the short answer. I might have to get back to the pooled group to answer that one. Someone said, pity I don't have NBN because I'm breaking up. I do apologise for that. I actually do have NBN, but it's fixed wireless. The next question is, from Nick Pearce, if you have no limit to your access to capital, is best absolute return the best? Oh, that's a very good question, Nick. Yes, that is a good question. Look, if you have no limits to access to capital, then yes, you may well be better off going for the higher returns per hectare. I'm yet to find that person, or I'm yet to deal with the person that doesn't have that issue of access to capital. And I could pull a cheap banker quib here, Nick, but in the interest of you keeping face, I won't do that to you. You may have no problems with access to capital, but the majority of us do. Are there any other questions on that cheap shot I've taken at Nick Pearce there? Or any other points I'm willing to take? Okay, I've got another one here. If you're doubling your carrying capacity from 8 to 16, aren't you by definition doubling your production? Once the initial capital outlay has taken place, you're in maintenance mode with similar costs to existing pasture. Sorry if this is Farm Management 101. No, look, your point is a really good one, because I have actually missed some important points that are worth pointing out, Ian. So thanks for making this point. There are actually some other marginal costs that increase. And one of the big ones, although it's not huge, is the first assumption I made was 0.8 of a kilo of phosphorus per DSE. So that means the single super that you applied for your 8 DSE rate is very different to the single super rate that you apply for 16 DSEs. I have also assumed that there are some marginal increases in other things, chemical expenses and so on, but I think they equated to roughly $5 to $10 per hectare, so they weren't significant. So that is why that's why you get that narrowing relative to what you would expect under the assumptions in your question. So I hope that answers that question. It's a very good question, so thanks for asking it. Someone's just made the point that they'd like to work for a boss that has no limit on capital. I think we all would. Have you looked at climate change in your assumptions? Look, the short answer is no, I haven't here, but I have looked at it in other ways, and the other way I looked at it was, I guess, from a risk perspective, and this might go some way to answering your question, John. That is, when I looked at the risk perspective, that is how often, I guess what I tried to do was factor in the probability of failure, and when you add the probability of failure, that adds cost, and it means that you need to put a risk premium on the investment, which means that 15% probably isn't enough to warrant you doing it. Now, remembering that a lot of you may not have that lime cost in there, and that'll make a pretty big difference. I think that made up to 5% difference in return rate from memory. So, it's a good point, and that's the only thing I've looked at regarding that climate change, which is not really climate change. It's more an issue of weather and the effects of weather than or volatility in seasonal conditions rather than climate change. The next question is, does the short-term high-performance pasture reduce your exposure to risk due to improved cash flow, faster increase to the stocking rate? Does it reduce my exposure to risk? I don't know. I need to think about that one. Does it reduce I'm struggling to think how it would reduce my exposure to risk. I guess the only point that I can think of is that if you got a failure, you only have that failure over a very short period, and you can get back in again shortly. So you've written off $1,000 relative to, I'm struggling. I don't know. I need to think about that. The next question, sorry, I'll try and get back to you, Scott, about that. I just haven't put enough thought into how it might reduce risk. The next question is, someone's made a point on that there. Thanks for contributing, Ted Callanan. No is the answer. Short-term, high risk, high reward. If it doesn't rain, you have nil, is the comment that Ted's made. James Christie's just asked another question. John, have you looked at the lay pasture returns on mixed farms at all? Look, I haven't, and I didn't want to look at it necessarily tonight. I think, yes, we have looked at it. I haven't been back to it for a while though, James, so I'm not going to contribute the outcome of it tonight. So I might have to get back to you on that one. The next point is, or question is, are there any other technologies, e.g. genetic improvement of stock, that generate equivalent returns to pasture improvement? There's stacks, Joe, stacks. If it depends on what your existing level of production is, but the first one would be improving feed utilisation, which is really your lowest hanging fruit, which is more mouths, basically. In terms of genetics, yes, genetics in livestock are an area. It could be that investment in labour-saving devices is another area. There's so many possible areas that you can invest. The limit is capital, although the limit for capital is not everyone's concern. The next question is, how do land care type issues such as weed control and reducing waterlogging influence the profitability equation? Such as weed control and reducing waterlogging influence the profitability equation? Well, I guess the short answer to that is if you are getting I guess what that would do, David, in an attempt to answer your question, is my guess is if you've got waterlogging and weed control issues, your blue line in the graph that we're looking at would drop further down. And where that blue line drops further down, it just means that you have a higher marginal benefit, which means it would actually push the economics in favour of pasture improvement. Now that is under the assumption that you don't have the same concerns in the improved pasture. So I hope that answers your question. Are there any other questions or comments? Anyone's able to take a cheap shot at me too. The next point is from Scott McDougall. I may have missed it, but in the scenarios for the high performance ryegrass, how long is it before you break even? Okay, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it looks to be around year. So because we have this zigzag effect, it's year 7, but then you duck back under again, and then you go out to year 10 before you're starting to break even, Scott. So under the assumptions that I've made for that curve. Now, it could be that if you have higher production than what I'm talking, basically what happens is the steepness of that curve after the initial $1,000 decline actually increases. So what happens is the number of years to break even declines as well. Someone's made a point here, but does a short-term ryegrass pasture increase risk in times of low rainfall and high temperatures in a supposedly high rainfall environment due not to making the 4-year time frame? Yes, well, my view on that, look, I'm going to put the caveat out here that I know I haven't had a lot of exposure to short-term perennial pastures I'm talking short-term tetraploids or annuals or diploids or whatever, because my view is that they don't stack up. But the question is, does a short-term ryegrass pasture increase risk in times of low rainfall and high temperatures in a supposedly high rainfall environment due to not making the 4-year time frame? Look, my guess is that's the case. You know, my understanding of those pastures is that they need high rainfall environments, and that the levels of productivity that or production that they generate in those high rainfall environments are high. But when you don't get adequate rainfall, yes, you get a big reduction in the stocking rate, but you could argue that on the perennial pasture you get exactly the same thing. So the next point is made by Sandy Middleton. Have you looked into the benefits of short-term pastures in filling feed gaps and how that contributes to overall productivity of the system? In this analysis, no, I haven't. In other analyses, have I? Yes. Have they stacked up? No. Because I guess short-term feed gaps, yes, they can assist in filling short-term feed gaps, but I guess my view is the feed production curve is a feed production curve. You can manipulate it to some extent, but it's very costly to do it. And so my view is you're better off setting your system up and working with your system to match that feed supply and feed supply curve than you are trying to push it through high cost means like ryegrasses and so on. That's my view. Do I have the numbers to support that at the moment? Look, I don't in front of me now, but I will try and see whether I've got them there somewhere. what average annual rainfall would be assumed for the scenario 16 for that 16 DSEs per hectare? Thanks for the question. Look, that's, I guess, well, if we work on the French and Schultz model, it's roughly, I guess, a 600 mil rainfall area. So what's 650 minus 250 is 200, and there's 425. Yeah, so roughly a I guess a 600 mil rainfall environment is pretty close to where I would expect to be running 16 DSEs per hectare. But look, this is all dependent on class of country. It's dependent on a whole range of factors. And I'm talking about average annual stocking rates there, not midwinter stocking rates. So in a beef system, that average annual stocking rate, you would expect a midwinter stocking rate of somewhere around 13 DSEs per hectare or thereabouts. Are there any other questions or comments that people would like to make? The questions appear to have slowed down. So look, I think if there's any, thanks for everyone's input today. Look, if there's any other, if I can follow up on those few questions that I didn't answer very well today, I will. I'll attempt to. You may not be back to tomorrow. It might be a little bit further down the track. But look, really appreciate everyone's input and the good questions, and we look forward to seeing you. Please do the survey. It's really important to us. The survey is absolutely critical for us. So if you can just log off and do that survey, that would really please us. We don't care if the feedback's good or otherwise. We really need that feedback. So thanks for your contributions tonight. Hopefully you've got something out of it, and we look forward to seeing you at the labour efficiency webinar on Monday next week, so that you can go to the races on Tuesday. All right. Thanks for your input tonight. Night night.